cotton too. Right?
Okay. I think we're all pretty much ready now. Just get the last few people to sit down and we'll all be good. Yeah, that's... So I think everyone can see there okay. Can you see the screen okay from the back? All good. So, yeah, that's good. Okay, so yeah, thanks for coming out today on a bit of a sunny day, a bit cool, but it's a nice little location here. We haven't been to this one before, so it's always good to look out the golf greens. Going to introduce our staff today because we've got a new person up from the coast. That's Joel Fletcher, so put your hand up, Joel. So Joel's been a planner for 10 years and wanted to move his family to Canberra, so we found him a job here, so keep him happy, pay the bills, and he'll be integrating into our operations over the next couple of years, and he'll be, as I fade out, over the next couple of years. But we're going to be in good hands. Also, there's Abdul, as you know, he's also a financial planner with us now, and so he's been with us 5 years, 6 years? 6 years. As you know, he's come from Fiji and got accounting qualifications, and he also redid his accounting qualifications in Australia, so he's a CPA accountant. And he's more on our technical side, but also sits in on our interviews as well. So he's another authorised representative. That means he's qualified to give advice as well. And Nicola's with us for 2 years, 3 years?
2.5.
2.5, yeah. Come across from another financial planning firm in Canberra, and has been in the financial planning industry for, well, you started when you were 5, so 20 years.
This is my age, 18 years.
So there you go. So yeah, very experienced in the industry. Worked in head offices in Sydney, in BT. Worked in financial planning firms. So good experience there. So just thought I'd introduce you because we're getting bigger each year. Our daughter's gone back to Sydney, so she's gone and got a job in financial planning in Sydney, and now with a boyfriend down there. So, and my wife's obviously still there doing all the accounts. So that's our team at this stage. So now we start on the 2 topics today. One is on the Trump economics, and the main issue there is the tariff wars that are going on. The second one, we'll talk about Australia as an economy and contrast that to what Trump's trying to do for his economy and what we've done over the last 20 or 30 years to make our economy very successful. The only economy in the world, in the first world, that's had uninterrupted no recessions for 28 years. No other country in the world has done that. The other country that did it was Holland or Netherlands, and they did it for 27 years. We just beat them just recently on the record. So if you're looking at an economic model, Australia doesn't do too badly. So anyway, we'll start with Trump economics and go through what he's been proposing. So you probably remember that he got elected November 2016, but never really took power. Or they don't take power until the following year in January. So he's been there nearly 2 years, coming up to elections next year. And he said he'd make America great again. He's a great promoter, a great salesman, and he's told enough positive things to be elected. And one of his major things was to make America great again through getting back into manufacturing things. The reality is that 80% of the US economy is actually services, so he's got a fairly big job in front of him. But his political base was really the Midwest, where the manufacturing sector had been hollowed out. They called it hollowed out, where it's been moved to China, or maybe to Mexico, or other low-wage countries. So the problem is that you can't really get those industries back because they're low value added, and you're not going to get Americans to work for the same wage as somebody in China or somebody in Vietnam or somebody in Mexico. So it's a bit of a fallacy to say he's going to get manufacturing, but it got him across the line. Another thing he was going to do was to renegotiate the American Free Trade Agreement, which was between Canada and Mexico. There was really no major changes there. He said that he made the greatest deal ever. but that's all just showmanship, basically. He was going to reduce taxes for individuals. He did get that through Congress. But of course they're running up a great deficit because of that, because in the past the American economy has been running up deficits for many years. It's only under the Clinton era that they actually started to pay back the debt, and every president since then has been running up debt. So the main issue was the taxes. It does help the economy. If you've got more money in your pocket, you can spend it. It had an increase in their GDP last year of around 0.25%, but it's a one-off thing. You don't get that every year. Infrastructure. He's promised to build roads and bridges and ports. Nothing's happened on that basically because he hasn't got any money, because Congress won't give any money. Companies like Macquarie Bank and interesting super funds in Australia were quite interested in that, because one of the success stories of Australia is that we've used infrastructure as a way to create a more efficient economy, but also create more growth in the economy. But he's saw Australia doing it, and he's basically tried to take a leaf out of the book, but he, as I said, he doesn't have the money. He can't even get money to build a wall between Mexico and America, so he's not getting money for these things either. Then the tariff war, which is the current thing that's on the newspapers, and we're going to look at that in detail, because the key thing is not just China that he's putting tariffs, it's also against the Europeans. He's put up tariffs, but the main one is against China, and he's got some pretty strong reasons for it, but this is just to show you how much he's put the tariffs up, and the last batch of tariffs was to increase it by another 10% on all goods that come in from China. So he's targeting one country particularly, but you can see here the increase in tariffs from roughly an average of 2%. He'll have tariffs roughly averaging 8% across the board if he brings those all in. Most countries have lower tariffs, mainly because it doesn't do your economy much good, because you're effectively taxing the people that consume those goods. So it's effectively a tax on the consumer, because the person who brings the good in is going to pay a higher price. The US government gets the tariff, so effectively that's their tax, and he's saying that there's he's bringing in $90 billion in tariffs. Now, that sounds an impressive figure, but it's not in the total context of things, but it does mean that the cost structure in America is going up. Everything you buy from China is going to go up in cost. So it's actually a cost into the economy. But most countries don't have high tariffs. Only countries that have high tariffs are generally being third world countries. Even China didn't have high tariff rates, but they've raised theirs because he's raising them and they're raising their tariffs. So in general, he's raised tariffs up to 25% on roughly $40 billion worth of goods, and 10% on another 200, and he's going to move a few of those, another 200 billion up to 25%. And last year he collected around $30 billion, this year's about 60, but eventually it's going to have to about $90 billion in taxes. He's taking off the American consumer. But of course he doesn't call them taxes, he calls them a tariff, and he assumes it's not coming from anywhere, but it's actually coming off the American consumer. This graph is just showing you, obviously, the ratcheting up of the tariffs he's putting on over the last, this is April this year and to August. In consequence, the Chinese are ratcheting up their tariffs as well. So there's $113 billion worth of US goods now have been affected by the tariffs. But of course, the Americans don't export as much to China as China exports to them. So the Americans are getting the worst end of the stick, because they're paying more tariffs, and that's costing them more money. So it's also against Europe. He wants to protect the American industry, particularly the car industry, but it's not got so much press. But the main reason he's directed at China is because they've had specific policies of unfair trade. And there's a lot of people in America, even on the Democrat side, who are in agreement with that. The Chinese have made all the American companies who go to China to go into joint ventures, and in those joint ventures they've got to provide their technology, bring the technology in from America, and they effectively get it for free. They also have been slow to protect foreign copyright. So, you know, when people have had movies or songs, they get copied in China and then resold under their own names. Obviously, blatant breaches of copyright. China is part of the World Trade Organization. They're supposed to crack down and stop that, but they basically look the other way. But you got to remember, they're running a country of 1.4 billion people. It's not like Australia of 25 million people. It is a very diverse country, huge regional differences, our language differences, cultural differences. It's a huge country to run. So that's one excuse for it, but really they really let the copyrights be infringed. Also, he's arguing that the Chinese have kept the currency low. Now, that's not quite true. The currency dropped only a few percentage points, but it's not massively undervalued. The Chinese have dropped their currency in response to him putting up tariffs. So in fact, what happens is automatically, normally a currency would drop if you can't export something, and that then negates the cost of the tariff in America. So if you can reduce your currency by 10% because they've raised the tariff by 10%, then you've negated the effect of the currency, effect of the tariff in America. So the tariff, all currencies do adjust for that if they're a floating currency. The Chinese currency is not a floating currency, but it is being adjusted for these things. Australia's got a floating currency, as you know, so we just move with the market. So the argument is that the Trump is arguing that they're using their currency to make their exports cheaper, which is true. That happens when you put tariffs up on the importing country. But the end result is that the US is still buying lots more from China than they can export. So this is saying that the deficit is just getting wider, which is not a problem for China, it's a problem for America. The reason why they're not exporting to China is because they don't have the goods the Chinese want. The Chinese are exporting things like clothing, textiles, footwear, and even cars now. That's what Americans want because it's cheap. They got a lot of companies like Walmart over in America, they consume a lot of this Chinese product because it's the cheapest and still reasonable quality. What Americans are exporting are more things like manufactured goods, aeroplanes, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the thing is that if the Chinese didn't have good products to buy, they wouldn't be selling them. So the real problem for America is it's not producing what the world wants in the quantities, but also they have a problem with savings. They are not saving enough to sustain their government deficits, sustain their banking industry for housing and other investments. I won't go into the argument, but it's a problem for America in not having a good economy, not the Chinese problem. So Trump's saying, okay, he can try and get the imbalance worked out by raising tariffs. Obviously, the idea is you make the cost of Chinese goods higher, therefore they buy less of them. The Chinese retaliated with $113 billion worth of tariffs, stopping the Americans exporting into their country. So the Americans are now keep ratcheting up the tariffs, and then the Chinese then respond in kind. But the ultimate, after doing all this, American exports to China have actually been stable. The first impact is China's decreasing demand for American goods because they're more expensive. And 7% of American goods went to China. And they're the high-end type products. Aircraft, like your Boeings and military aircraft, but many of the aircraft are coming in from Lockheed and companies like that. This would be machinery, this is machine tools, electrical machinery, medical equipment, motor vehicles. So that's what the Americans are exporting. but they're not huge in the scheme of things. The key thing is creating volatility, and obviously a lot of reason why you're here today is you're concerned that all this machinations with tariffs is going to bring on a recession. Well, I'll talk about it in a minute, but the first thing is you can see the volatility index has gone up. Not as much, it's been up higher in December. If you remember, September, October, November and December, the share markets fell in Australia. They went down 14%. And this is the World Volatility Index, but all share markets around the world went down 14% or more. Some parts they went up more. So we went through more volatility in December than we are currently now. So we always live with volatility. It's just a matter of can we make money out of it? And we'll talk about that. But this is a couple of other indexes on volatility. This one's saying we're up to the same level as 2012. And that was when we came out of the GFC. The gold index has gone up, which is another source of indicating of volatility. When you think the world's going to end, you buy gold. Okay, the price of gold has gone up from $1,400 to $1,500. It's gone up $100. Not the end of the world yet, but that's what people will buy if there's a source of security. So what's going to happen with this turmoil is actually affecting more than just the Chinese-American trade. It'll affect Australia. But the thing is that it may mean that a lot of countries really won't want to participate in buying American goods because it's too easy for the Americans to declare war on them. That's one of the side effects that Trump's not really thinking of, that he's creating all this instability thinking he's going to win, but he may create long-term problems for the American economy. The other thing to remember is that most complex products have huge lead times. They're bringing in components from all around the world. Just the mobile phone that you use, about 3% of the components are only made in China. Now, okay, they're assembled in China, but some of the components come from America, some from Europe. One of the components that allows you to tip your mobile to the side, and so you can get your side vision on a photo or anything like that, that comes from France. So there's huge amounts of components coming into just the mobile phone. Now, all this instability about pricing of tariffs and pricing of products is now thinking that if you're going to be producing something like a mobile phone, you think, well, maybe I shouldn't buy things from America because I don't know what the price is. And if I don't know what the price is, I don't think I want to, I'll want a discount on the buying that product because it could be hit with a tariff if I bring it into China. And the other side of the coin is if you're bringing stuff into America and you're manufacturing in America, you're going to be concerned about buying things from China as well, or anything outside of America. Now that's his aim, is to try and get companies to make things in America, but you can't just overnight make a lot of these very sophisticated products that go into cars or your mobile phone or into everything from air conditioning units. There's a lot of components which are only made in one country, or they're very specifically made by one company. So this complex world of componentry is going to be a real issue for the future about how people buy things. So it could mean that non-American manufacturers are favour non-American suppliers because of that. And of course, America's only 25% of the world economy. It's still huge, but there's a lot of other manufacturing goes on in the world outside of America. So will these increases create a recession? Well, Americans bought $540 billion worth of goods from China. They have to pay now more for that, and the costs will be borne by American businesses and consumers. Now, it could be that the people who are manufacturing products and exporting them out of America now have higher cost structures because they're bringing in components that are now higher cost. They've got to re-export that out of America if they're going to be an exporter, and potentially not be as competitive, might not be able to get the sales that they used to. So all this tariff war is ending up that last year the Chinese exports to the US went up 11%. So all these tariff wars not actually working, while the US exports to China only went up 0.7. So at this stage, it's not working. Chinese products are still cheaper, better made or whatever for Americans to buy. And the second issue now is going to be confidence in America, because what's happening is that American producers, that is the owners of businesses, are saying, well, if I can't rely on the cost structure of my business because the tariffs may go up and up and up, I won't invest. I won't buy that new factory, I won't put on new staff. And what's happening in America is that you're getting a decline, and across the world there's a decline in what we call the PMI index, which is a Purchase Manager Index. That is the people who buy components or products inside a company. So they have an index of, are you buying more products or less products each month? And so this grey line here, grey-green line, is showing that confidence is declining. So if it goes below 50, what that means is they're not buying as much in the previous month. But if it was 55 down to 52, it means that they're still buying products, but they're not buying as many as the previous quarter or the previous month. So there's a decline there. The only positive side of that in this graph is that there is a potentially increase in GDP next year. Now, what they're saying here is that orange line is GDP world growth. So 2017-18, around the world, the average growth around the world was around over 3.5%. This year it's declining down to probably around 2%, but next year the expectations may kick back up to 3%. So that's positive, but one of the issues about the PMI index is an indicator of business confidence, about whether you buy a new factory and put new people on. So if confidence is down, there's potentially less people buying, putting staff on. The implications of what Trump is doing is actually breaking what we call the world trade system. So that's not really been understood because it's a very hard concept to say. But a lot of this, what he's doing is the bull in the China shop, is he's now breaking the world trading system that was set up in 1944 under what they call Bretton Woods Agreement in America. The Allies at the time said, well, we want to create a world which is better, and free trade is going to help the world dig themselves out of the Second World War. During this Great Depression, one of the things that made the Great Depression worse was the Americans put a 30% tariff on all imports. That threw America into greater depression in the 1930s than it would have been if they left free trade, because it stopped a lot of new businesses getting inputs from overseas, and it knocked confidence in just at the time when people were becoming unemployed. And as you know, in Australia we had a 32% unemployment in Australia in the Great Depression, about 1932, and another third of the population only had part-time jobs. Now, we don't want that to happen again, but one of the things they did sit down before the Second War finished and said, well, how are we going to get the world to recover? And the answer was free trade. So the Bretton Woods Agreement, around the 44-45 mark, world trade has just been going gangbusters ever since. So they set the rules for free trade, to get free trade working. There was the World Trade Organization was developed here in the 1990s to also promote world trade. So these foundations are being now rocked by what Trump is doing. So under this system, the Bretton Woods system, world income since 1950 has gone up 4 times. That's 500%. Between 1950 and 2017, world trade has increased by 39 times. So free trade and trade is good because it means that you are able to get countries to specialise in the things they're good at. Australia's good at mining, it's good at agriculture. We're not good at making cars, that's why we've closed industries down. We're not good at manufacturing because we don't have cheap labour, we don't have the labour force for it, but we're very good at mining and manufacturing. We should stick to that. That's what this country's done, or talk about that more later. But the main issue here is that the world is getting more complex, and the chain of industries which source components all around the world has got more and more complex. So this is just saying that you've got a much more complex world than it used to be. People are sourcing components from all around the world for mainly making manufactured products. The other thing that free trade has done is lift a lot of people out of poverty. One of the things that the world has done in the capitalist world versus the communist world fell apart because they couldn't produce the goods to keep people in the homes and cars, whereas the capitalist system has. And it's lifted something like 75% of the population off a $2 a day, that's indexed, it's at the real dollars. 75% of the world's population now live on more than $2 a day. Whereas before, there was a lot of poverty around the world, in the third world. And even in Europe, Europe was destroyed. Lots of parts of Europe were destroyed, and people were living pretty close to the bone there as well. So free trade makes countries richer. Australia's gone down the free trade route with previous governments. It also means consumers have more services and goods at lower cost than you would have if you had high tariffs. Tariff is a tax. It's going to cost you money. And even though America is still 25% of the world economy, it has 139 of the top 500 companies in the world. And the share market accounts for 53% of the world share market. So a lot of the wealth is still in America. So, well, what happens in America is important for us. In fact, sorry, go back there. In fact, the top 18 companies in the world, of the top 20, are American. They call them the FANG. For instance, Facebook, Alphabet, Amazon, and I forget the other two, but there's a lot of technology companies are in America. They're not in Europe. You don't have a computer company that's, apart from SAS, I think SAS, yeah, it's a German company. There's very few technology companies that are not in America. So why should we worry about the US recession if there's going to be a contraction? Well, 17% of a balanced portfolio, so most are imbalanced, and if you're in growth portfolios, 17% of your money is in American shares, and about 22% in the growth portfolio. So it is important for you. It's not 100% of your portfolio, it's about around the 20% mark. So if that means if there's a 10% drop in the share market in America, roughly you lose 2% off the value of your funds. Not the end of the world, but it's important to see what impact it would be on you. Also reduce the demand for Australian goods. Now that's one thing that people are saying, oh well, it'll knock on to Australia, that we could go into recession because the Americans go into recession. Unlikely, because the main thing that the Chinese used our imports for, that is coal, iron ore, and now gas, is that they use it for infrastructure, building roads, ports, railways, housing. They don't use it to make cars to export to America. They're not a big car producer. Japan still is. So Reserve Bank Governor DeBell said the other day that the primary exposure of the Australian economy is to the domestic economy and not the Chinese or external sector. So what does that mean? It has a minimal impact on our exports. So we could pretty much say that even if America goes into recession, it's not going to be the end of the world for us. We'll still need our coal and iron ore and our gas. The other thing is that the American economy is growing quite strongly. It's a mature economy like Australia. They're actually growing quicker than we are. Now, it's a bit like putting an anchor on a boat. If you have uncertainty, yes, it pulls your economy back, but doesn't automatically click you straight into recession. It'll slow the economy down, that's my view. Also, they've got extraordinarily low unemployment. This unemployment in America is as low as it was in 1969. It's never been lower since 1969. So you've got a lot of what we call momentum in the economy. If you've got 3.7% unemployment, you've pretty much got everyone in America working. In the GFC in America, they had 11.5% unemployment. So we're nowhere near, obviously, that situation. We don't want to go anywhere near it, but the thing is, you're coming from a very strong economy that is getting back. There is a lot of uncertainty over there, but it's not, in my view, going to knock their economy over. Also, American interest rates are low. They're lower than Australia. They did raise interest rates last year, but in the last 3 months, they've dropped their interest rates by 0.5%. Now, why is that important? Is because then you can get the economy to go quicker, stimulate the economy. So what we're saying is that this is that they're already starting to stimulate the economy. So this is a positive. It's like the accelerator car. If you want the car to go faster, you put your foot on the accelerator. In the economy, you put the interest rates down. Now, interest rates are at historic lows. They're only about, well, in Australia, they're only about 1% on cash rates. In America, they're about 1.5%, but they're not high. Normally, you get high interest rates before a recession because the economy, if it goes too fast, you put interest rates up, and then the economy goes into a slowdown, and then you've got to drop interest rates. So they're already starting to drop interest rates in America. The other thing about the American economy is it's a very strong economy. You don't have 25% of the world's GDP by just having a third world economy. You've got an economy with films and entertainment, aerospace, telecommunications, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, automotive, steel, defence, IT, oil extraction. They export a lot of agricultural products, soybeans, timber, cotton even. So they're an economy which actually exports a lot of the top end, the high end, from aeroplanes to high tech, and the bottom end, which is the low value added, which is grain and timber. And also do a lot of export of food processing too. You'll find American products in the supermarkets. So it's a very strong economy. So it's not as if it's a third world economy, poorly run, high rates of unemployment with poor administration, poor legal systems. It's a very good economy. It's one of the easiest places in the world to do business. It's number 8 in the world rankings as far as how easy it is to do business. Funny, New Zealand is currently number 1. We're at number 18. And what they're taking account of is how easy is it to get a business set up, how easy to employ people, what sort of regulations are on business and things like that. So it's still a very competitive economy. It's still easy to do business. In fact, it's easier to do business in America than in Australia. In fact, some Australian companies have gone over there. Pratt Industries have gone over to America and built paper manufacturing companies because they can do it cheaper in America than Australia. And in fact, Boral built a plant over in the south of America, southern parts of the US as well, because they found it was easy to get their manufacturing done there. So the other thing to consider is the amount of imports that comes into the American economy is a very small part of the total economy. It's only 2.6% of the American economy. So when you say there's a tax on it, it's a very small part of your total consumption that is actually being taxed, 2.6. So it's important, but it's not like 50% of your imports were, 50% of GDP is in imports. Very small. Because the US economy is 21,000 billion, and it's only about 540 billion of imports from China. So the impact of that is pretty minimal on your total consumption. The other thing is that they're 80% of their economy is services. So there's not as if like they're in Germany, where Germany imports a lot of components from all the parts of Europe. They bring in alternators, radiators, seats, all from different parts of Europe, and then they put it into components into their cars or whatever they make. If you had a very high manufacturing component in your economy, and then you put tariffs on bringing things in, then that would feed into a problem for your manufacturing industry. But most of America is actually services. It's your food chains, it's your technology industries, it's your computing industries. They don't need manufacturing inputs from China to actually operate their businesses. So the impact on most businesses in America is is not direct. It's only really more consumer goods. As I said, textiles, clothing, footwear, things you buy, clothing that you buy through the Walmarts in America, that's what's affecting it. And another point on that is, if it does affect China, in the sense that they won't be exporting as much, it'll affect countries like Malaysia, which produces rubber, countries like Egypt, which produces cotton, countries that produce the textiles or the rubber that you need in those sort of manufacturers. So basically the concept is that you've got a very high service industry economy which doesn't use a lot of inputs from China directly in manufacturing. So it's more a consumer economy. So my conclusion is that even though there's a trade war is not a good thing, it's not going to be the end of the world for America, because it's a service economy. It's running literally at 100 miles an hour now. If it pulls back to 80 miles an hour, that's not a recession. A recession is when you lose, you have 2 quarters of negative growth. That is, you're not growing at all. It seems very difficult from where we are to see that. And even a former Obama Treasury official says he estimates the drop in GDP in America is only going to be about 0.2% in 2019 and another 0.1% if they do put in additional tariffs. So remember, they're growing about 2.25%. That brings them back to 2%. That's not a recession. A recession is when you're negative. So we're not talking recession. But from your point of view, you're hearing all the negatives. You're hearing the market's going up and down, went down last week, it's gone back up this week. What we're trying to say to you is that that's a good thing for you, because if we can buy when it's down and then it recovers, and it buys when it's down and recovers, we can actually make more money for you. Volatility is your friend, not your enemy. So you want it to go up and down, because if we had it going up in a nice straight line, the returns are less, because we can't find places to buy cheaply. Because your funds move around between Australian shares, overseas shares, property, government bonds and cash. And they're moving around to buy the cheapest goods all the time, the cheapest assets. If it just goes up and it gets more expensive, we can't do that. We can't make money out of the volatility. So we know that last year, September, October, November, December, the market went down 14%. Your funds actually bought 14% more Australian shares, because we had to. The previous 2 years, the Australian share market went up 20%. We sold down 20% because we had too much in that sector. That rebalancing process allows us to sell high and buy back in cheap. So if it didn't drop, we wouldn't be able to buy back. So we want it to go up and down. Volatility is your friend, not your enemy. So that's why I'm saying it's okay. We can see that really there's not a great potential for a recession in America, even with the best efforts of Mr. Trump. But you've got to think that all this is doing your portfolio some good, not bad, because we can move around inside the funds of funds. So the other issue to say is that if we're buying into the share market, is it a good time to buy or a bad time to buy? We might be buying in at an overvaluation. Well, this is just looking at different share markets around the world. It's done by AMP Capital, headed by Shane Oliver. In Australia, we don't think it's expensive. We think it's on the cheap side. So to buy into the Australian share market is a good thing. Europe looks reasonably cheap. It's not expensive. USA looks reasonably cheap too. It's not expensive. Even though the share market in America has been going up for the last few years, their profits have been going up as well. So as long as your profits go up, it's not more expensive. Japan's not cheap, not expensive really. So if we can go back in the markets now while the market's down, we can buy some cheap goods, cheap assets. And the reason why you want to buy it's cheap, because the income is higher when you buy them at a lower price. That's the reason, because you then get a higher income on your portfolio. So is profits going up or down? This year, profits are still going up in Australia, Japan, Europe and America. So the profits that you get is dividends have gone up this year. They've gone up last year, they've gone up the year before. The year went down was 2016 in Europe and Japan. But we had a booming share market, so you didn't notice. But this next year, we expect profits to still go up. In fact, the US profits are going to be the best of those 4. So you want to buy because you're getting more income. So my conclusion is that, the other issue that people are talking about is this negative yield curve. So what they're saying is that if you get a negative yield curve, it means that they're expecting that the interest rates will go down in the future, so you'll pay less for a government bond in 10 years than you will for a 2-year bond. That's the theory. Now, the Australian yield curve is still positive, so you get a higher interest rate on a 10-year or 30-year bond than you do for 2 or 3 years. And that's because you've locked your money away. And interest rates could go up in that meantime, and you might be bought a 1.4% interest bond, and interest rates go up 1%, you lose out if you're on a 30-year bond. That's the normal story. Normally, you get higher interest for locking your money away longer. This is the US yield curve. Now, what it's showing here is the differential between a 10-year bond and a 2-year bond. So it's saying that normally you get a lower interest rate on a 2-year bond versus a 10. Well, that's been all this year, except to the last month, and it's just gone what they call it negative. That is, you're getting a slightly higher rate on a 2-year bond than a 10-year bond, but slightly. You're normally talking of a huge differential of 1 or 2%. The differential is 0.1 or 0.2. We're not talking a serious amount. Now, the reason why they're saying this is usually related to recession is because if you think there's going to be a recession, you'd rather lock your money in long term because interest rates normally drop in recession. But the differential is not expecting a major difference in the interest rates there. So even though they're using this as a headline in the newspaper, it's really a bit exaggerated. And as I said, the differential is normally greater. So it's not a great argument. In fact, Guy Debelle, the Reserve Bank, says he's argued that structural factors make that yield curve argument an unconvincing barometer. I like that word. The key thing is he's saying, well, you can use these extrapolations from the past to predict the future, but they're not always going to predict the future. So he's basically saying it's not going to be relevant in this case because interest rates are in extraordinary low periods. We've never had interest rates lower in Australia's history, and also in America they've never been lower in their history of, I think it's about over 200 to 300 years of governments in America. So it's unusual because they've been using interest rates, quantitative easing during the GFC and later to artificially keep interest rates low. So you really shouldn't be using this as a guide for the future because it's been artificially pulled low. So I might just stop it there. Has anyone got some questions as we go along? So.
Russell, I can take the microphone.
Oh yeah, good idea, yeah. If anyone wants some more food or drink, there's plenty of food up the back.
I was going to take the microphone. Anybody's got a question?
Anyone want to break for a little bit of food?
Yeah, Russell, I've got a question.
Yeah.
The Americans are running up huge budget deficits. You know, in this country, the Americans are running up huge budget deficits.
That's right, yeah.
I don't know what the figures are, but it's
it's
trillions.
about 92% of the GDP.
Yeah. Now, in this country, that's regarded as anathema, and the Liberals run around saying, oh, you know, you've got to balance the budget and it's a disaster, debt and all that.
Relatively, yeah, that's right, yeah.
So what's going to happen? I mean, the Americans can't just keep going on doing that, can they? Won't it all fall apart?
Yes and no. I agree with what you're saying, and there is a point. There's an argument that says once you hit 100% GDP debt in your government, there's no possibility of paying it back. Now, Greece went up to around 136% of GDP's debt. They were saved by the Germans. Basically, the EU came in and bailed them out, and they've been in recession since 2009. Their economy's contracted by 30%. That is, there's 30% less wealth in that country than was previously, and their economy's still in decline. They're still losing GDP each year. So you don't want to get to that position. US though, is a bit different because it's got the world currency. So there's moves afoot to actually get a new world currency because the US dollar is the world currency. So they've got a little bit of protection on that front, in the sense that if you're a world currency, everyone has to keep your dollars in reserves as your national reserves. So we keep Australian, obviously in Australia we have reserves of euros and American dollars and a few things, but the US dollar is still the world currency. That has an impact on what the Americans can do, in the sense they're in a privileged position to be able to be a bigger debtor than everyone else. But yes, ultimately the US will have to come and face the fact that they're spending more than they consume in their governments. You've got to remember that Americans don't like government. They're a free enterprise people. They like to carry guns and things like that. They were set up by the Mayflower people who wanted to get away from persecution. They therefore don't like big organisations, and government's one of them. So there's not much political capital in paying debt back in America, because they don't believe Uncle Sam is a good thing to have the money with anyway. But whereas Australia was set up by a government effectively, when you think about it, and we're used to having governments involved in our economy. But yes, right, I mean, once you hit around 100% GDP, it starts to get a problem to pay it back. But we're in now ultra low interest rates. So if you're borrowing at 1 or 2% interest rates, it's not that much of a burden on your economy to be able to borrow money from the public and spend it. Now, the only thing is, what do you spend it on? Do you spend it on new armaments, or do you spend it on roads, bridges and hospitals? That's the question in America. They're not spending it on their infrastructure. They're spending on their military spending. That's one thing. And they tend to be always wanted to go to war somewhere. So they tend to always want to be, once you go to war somewhere, you've got your troops overseas, so you've got to buy the currency of the, Iraq or wherever you go. You've got to use that money, your US dollars, and convert it into Iraqi dinars or whatever to pay for it. So that's always a problem. But yes, you're right, they're not facing their problems. But I don't think it's a problem for next year or the year after. But ultimately, there'll probably be a move to another world currency. That's where it'll come in unstuck. But they've got capacity to, they're a very wealthy country. They've got capacity to increase taxes. Just that Americans are very anathema to it, that's all. So any other questions here? No? All good? So we're going to talk about Australia now, which is a bit more positive. We'll talk about our debt in Australia, and we'll work through it. So where we are today is roughly since 1990, Australia's wealth, as in what we're producing, is around 50% greater than we were in 1990. Now you think, oh, wages have gone up, but this is in real terms. In real terms, we drive better cars, we travel overseas, we don't go to the south coast anymore for holidays, we go to Bali or Europe, whatever. We are much, much wealthier than we used to be. And a lot of that change started with the Hawke Keating government. And it was one of the things that started that process was the recession in 1991, which, as I said, we've had nearly 28 years of unprecedented growth. That is, we haven't had a recession since then. And the 91 recession was one we had to have, as Hawke Keating said, but it really knocked the system around because it dropped. We got rid of this cycle of inflation, which was distorting our economy. And it distorts it because it's easy to buy a house and make money out of it than go and build a business. Because all you have to do is buy a house, and it was going up 10% a year. All you have to do is buy houses and you would become a multi-millionaire. Just as many as you can buy. Instead of one house, you buy 5 or 10, as much as the bank will lend you. But the key thing is the recession was a good thing. It's not good for you at the time if you lose your job, but the key thing is it does restructure your economy. It gets your economy, gets rid of the deadwood out of the economy. It's like when you go and do your garden. If you do a real big clean up, things don't look so good initially, but things grow back. So the first thing I said was that it stopped the cycle of CPI rises. That the national wage case used to be Bob Hawke involved in that. Get a raise in your wage by 10%, costs for the employer would go up 10%, so then your wages would have to go up 10%. That was going through the cycle. That cycle stopped in the 91 recession because people couldn't expect or couldn't argue or bargain their wages up by 10% every year anymore. That knocked that cycle of inflation out. It also means that you did have businesses go bankrupt. Not good. They closed their business, but it also released all those resources, the buildings, the people, the money that they had invested into new industries. So it allows you to your whole economy to reinvigorate itself, to go in new directions. If it was in old industries and you kept propping them up, they're not going to move out of that unless you have a recession. One of the problems of Japan is that Japan's been technically in recession since 1991. Now you think, well, Japan's a good, successful economy. Well, it's not really, because they haven't grown. Their economy hasn't got any wealthier in the last 28 years. They haven't got over the recession in 91 yet, because they still prop up all their old industries, and they haven't culled out a lot of their inefficient ones. Recessions make consumers focus on saving. A lot of people will spend up to their maximum until you hit a recession, and then they realise, oh, we better put more away for the future, and they start to become more prudent in what they borrow. Recessions do refocus people on more saving and spending. As I said up here, if your friend loses their job, it's a recession, but if you lose a lot of job, it's a depression. And of course, the unemployed will not be consuming the same amount of goods and services, not paying the home loans back. That is a drag on the economy. But it's short-lived, because what happens is when the unemployed then go out and get a new job, hopefully get a better job or a more higher paying job, and they start to get back into the workforce again. So recessions are a cycle, it's not the end of the world. Another thing that happens is the banks are getting more cautious on lending, so they only then lend to the best businesses, the most profitable businesses. They get more cautious. So the money's invested in a better way. Then you had the Hawke-Keating reforms, and they were in the 1980s, but they really didn't come into play in the 1990s, because we cut back tariffs on textiles, clothing, footwear, and cars. They're the industries we weren't good at. And the key thing there is that started the process where the price of cars started to go down. The price of textiles, you know, going back in the 1980s, you could only buy one imported car, bring in one imported car if you had 3 cars manufactured in Australia. That was what I call a quota system. They also had tariffs of 30, 40, 50%. So we're buying cars more expensive than the rest of the world. And that cost feeds into everything. The cost of a car feeds into the guy who's working on a farm, the guy who's manufacturing, the guy who works in mining. Those costs were feeding into everything. Clothing, you couldn't, they had quotas on clothing, you couldn't bring in imported clothing. So the cost of clothing now is much, much cheaper than it was. But the main thing is then you can move resources into the better industries. The industries that we're good at, mining, say tourism now is a big industry. You can move people into those industries so that they're now working in those sectors where they're getting potentially better pay. Mining industry is one of the best paid industries in Australia. Floating the Australian dollar, we forget that we used to have a fixed dollar. We used to fix it against the US dollar. Donald Trump would call that currency manipulation today, but that's what the Chinese do. They've got a fixed currency, but we've got Australian dollars. So what happens is, if our mining and agriculture exports go through a decline, their prices decline, our Australian dollar falls. Now, that means the Australian exporters don't necessarily miss out, because what happens is most contracts from gold to all the mining, all the mining commodities are written in US dollars, and most of the agricultural commodities, except wool, are written in US dollars. So if you had the Australian dollar at $1, and the American dollar is $1, and the Australian dollar then fell to 50 cents, well then you're going to get paid $2 Australian for selling your wool or whatever you're going to sell. So the price of the Australian, floating the Australian dollar allows us to go through recessions without too much impact on our industries, because they get paid more when the Australian dollar falls. So if the So you've got one thing happening, you get the price of the commodity going down, but you're getting paid more for the commodity because it's converted back from US dollars. So that's a self-stabilising process. Then you've got the deregulation of the banking industry, which brought in mortgage brokers, and mortgage brokers started to get going about 1995. But in the past, banks used to have a 5% margin between what you borrowed at and what they got from you in the bank. So if you got 10% in on a term deposit, they were lending at 15. Now the mortgage broker said, well, we don't care about that. We'll be able to get money from overseas, and they got money overseas cheaper. And they brought the cost of margin between borrowing and lending to around 2%. You can see here the fall. That's the fall from 2000. In fact, that if you go back to 1995, it would have been a 5% margin. So the fall in the margins are really what's saying is that means it's cheaper to borrow money. And if it's cheaper to borrow money, you can then have a bigger house, you can have a bigger car, all those sort of things, because you can borrow at a cheaper price. And that's a good thing for the economy, because you want your economy to operate as efficiently as possible in all the sectors. Even though banking is not an export sector, it feeds into people who are exporting, because they can borrow for their farms or their mines much cheaper than they did before. Then the GST came in under Howard, and that was a big change, because I think they got rid of 6 or 7 different taxes. The taxes that they got rid of, they were supposed to get rid of stamp duty that the states agreed to, but they didn't. But they got rid of a lot of sales taxes in the states, which are very inefficient, very costly to collect. If you're going to collect a tax, you want something that's very efficient to do. Fortunately in Australia, we collect one level of income tax. In America you have state taxes, and then you have to pay your federal tax. So you pay 2 lots of tax. So accountants got to do two tax returns in America. We got rid of that in 1941, I think it was, in the Second World War, because we said that we have to get our funds efficient, and John Curtin got the states to agree and said, well, the Commonwealth will collect the taxes and then give it back to the states. That's how we had that system evolve. So the key thing is you've got an efficient tax system through the income tax, but we didn't have a GST. Now the GST is a good tax because it taxes consumption. So if you want to stop people buying things, you make the price higher, and the GST made the price higher. The second thing is the GST also is inflation adjusted, because the price of things go up, therefore the GST will go up. So you're getting an efficient tax for the states. They don't have to collect the taxes. If Commonwealth collects the tax and gives it back to states. The second thing, though, is that the business owners are not going to cheat as much, because they use the input tax credit. So when you buy something and then resell it, you got the input tax credit to reduce the GST, because you're using the guy you bought the product from to pay your GST. If you didn't do that, if you didn't put down the input cost, you wouldn't get that credit. So it's a self-regulating system for GST. If it was a sales tax, you just put a sales tax on the top, and then every time someone sells it, there's no counting for what you bought the product for, if you bought the product for cash. Then the other major change was in giving the Reserve Bank the power to set interest rates. Before, the politicians had the power to set interest rates, and of course this is what Trump's trying to do now. He's trying to go to the head of Reserve Bank in America to drop interest rates. Well, his idea is that if you keep dropping interest rates to 0, then everyone's going to get cheap money and I'll get re-elected. So that's his logic. But the thing is, you've got to have interest rates that are reasonable for the depositor as well. People like you want a reasonable return on your money. If you drop interest rates to 0, which in many countries they are 0, and some countries it's negative, in Denmark, in Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands and Germany, you get negative interest rates. You put your money in the bank, you get when you get it back.
Why did you put it there?
Well, because your assumption is that if inflation is falling, then if you only get, let's say you get 99 cents back on your dollar, but inflation falls by 2%, you can still buy a good cheaper in the future. That is, you buy it at 98 cents. So technically, if you got negative inflation, you can do that. But they've done it because they just want to try to get their economy going, and that's a reflection of the European economy, that they're in a very slow economy world there, and they have to do radical measures to get people to invest and build and buy, build factories and buy new cars and so forth. So they've had to drop their rates to negative. We're obviously not that, and we hopefully won't be there, but the Reserve Bank says they don't think they'll go to zero rates in Australia, which is good for obviously people like yourself. You don't want zero rates in your bank. But that change is very important because it allows people who are keeping an eye on the economy, Reserve Bank, to make the right moves at the right time, hopefully. Now, they won't get it perfect, can't predict the future, but it's better than giving the blood bank to Dracula. So Australia's had 28 years of expansion, and it's not by luck, it's because of major economic change. And we're all benefiting from that. Primarily, it's to open up our economy to free trade, to open up the banking system. But one of the major things is that is free trade, that is tariffs. Reducing our tariffs was a big change in Australia because it made us focus on industries we're good at and get rid of the industries we're bad at. And the second thing, it made everyone cost of living cheaper. So that has opened up our economy, and our growth in the last 28 years has been very good. So this is growth going back obviously to 1965, I think. But you've got periods of high growth. This bar there is 3%. So there's many times we're growing at 3% or more. Currently, in the last, so that's 1991, where you had the big drop, negative return, negative growth, and then you had every year after that would have been positive. So we're growing an economy, making it more wealthy. But it's only because the government's made changes like taxation, tariffs, banking systems that open up the economy. Now, just looking back at your investments, the main thing about wealth is that you're creating wealth while you're working, so you consume it when you're retired. Around 40% of your money is overseas because we don't put all your eggs in a basket. You don't put all your into the Australian basket. For the next 10 years, we mightn't be doing as well. But one of the things it does do, from our economy point of view, is this $2.3 trillion in super fund around Australia, of which yours is part, is helping us now pay back some of the overseas debt. So as you know, Australia's been a net, I'm just going to show you here, I'll come back in a minute, but basically Australia has been a major borrower of money from overseas. We've done that since we started the economy in 1778. The thing is that we then have to pay back. If we borrow money from overseas, you've got to pay back income back to overseas people. Whether it's in America or Europe or Japan, you've got to pay that back. Now what's happening recently though is that we've got enough money invested overseas that now we're getting income from those investments, comes back into your portfolios. But that income now is rising. So we can see the income, this orange line, has been steadily rising over the last few years, and that's because we've got 40% of $2.3 trillion is in overseas investments. Money's coming back into Australia from the US, Europe, Japan, wherever it's invested. That's a positive thing for our what we'll call our balance of trade. So our balance of trade now is getting positive, and our current account. Now the current account is, I won't go into that, but basically the current account is where the division between income we get versus income we put overseas. But in this case, it's also rising as well. So on our trade balance, we're starting to see some positive movements. The other thing that's happening is less people on the age pension. Now, obviously, there's still around a third of the population doesn't get an age pension. Another third gets a part pension, but only about 40% get the full pension. That's declining. So even since 2010, there's 2% of the population has dropped off the full age pension. Another 2% dropped off the full part pension. So we're now getting a lot more people fully funded, which is a good thing, because a lot of countries in Europe don't have pots of money to pay their pensioners. They've got to tax people in the year and then pay that money out in the same year. And they have their national pension schemes to do that. They've promised them, the government's promised them a pension in retirement. And as we all know, there's a lot more baby boomers coming through the system who will want a pension. Australia's one of the few countries that's actually been well provisioned in that system. Looking at the super balances, obviously the people who've got the most are the people who are coming into retirement. But even people in retirement, even at 75, their balances have kept up pretty well. That's because our returns have been good. You know, if your returns are more than you draw out, your balance will either stay the same or go up. So even for 75-year-olds, their average balance is now over 350,000. That's the average balance. Whereas the average balance at 65 to 79 was about the same. So we've had the wealth of our economy is coming back into your investments and keeping the value of those investments. This is to show you the value of super funds that are being paid out at retirement. So what they're saying here is they've got, I don't know how many super funds here, probably 100 super funds. The average person is getting more than $500,000 in their super payouts, which is a fairly large amount. I say that anyone who's got more than $500,000 as a couple will get through retirement, with the age pension as well, but that will get you through the 20 years or 30 years of retirement. And you're getting, you know, more than half the population getting that as they retire. That's just the other one, pensions there. And we talked about debt. So Australia has run up a lot of debt in their government debt in the last few years. So that's 2008, which is the GFC, and we've run up a lot of debt. But if you look at where we put that debt, a lot of it's going into infrastructure, like the tram that's in Canberra here. That was partly financed by the federal government, and a lot of roads and bridges and that are being financed all through. You go down to Sydney through the M5 and all that. Just a lot of infrastructure is being spent in Australia, and railways as well. But the key thing here is we have run up the debt, yes, but it's now starting to stabilise. As long as we spend it on things that are productive, it adds to your economy. That is, you're going to have a more efficient economy. If you've got more schools or better schools, if you've got more roads, more infrastructure, you're going to get a better efficient economy. So, okay, we've run up our debt, but 40% GDP debt is not high by international standards. Most first world countries are running around 60 to 90% GDP debt in their governments alone. So we're not bad. So 40% GDP debt. But we're now getting into a positive surplus in the budget, so that will contract a bit. We've got low inflation, which means that you're not being the cost of businesses is not high to employ new people. Low interest rates mean you've also got confidence to invest, and the rest of the world is prepared to lend to us. Now, if we had high interest rates like happening in Argentina now, it's because nobody wants to invest, and you've got to bring money in from overseas, and you've got to pay a very high price for that. Another case is Turkey. They're paying 17% interest rates in Turkey on their banks, because most people fled Turkey once a lot of the economic policies were crazy. That money fled the country, and to get money back in, they've got to pay ultra high interest rates. So yes, government debt is starting to stabilise, and over the next few years will start to decline. Interest rates are low, as we know. People who lived through the 70s and 80s were used to 10 to 15% interest rates. Well, now we're quite low, and as I said, it's the lowest we've ever had in our history. Real wages have been increasing, but household wealth declined last year. Now, this is mainly Sydney and Melbourne. As you know, roughly half the population's in Sydney and Melbourne. They had roughly a 10% decline in housing, but generally their housing prices have been going up. And now our household incomes have been Real household incomes have been increasing. Net worth of our houses are now just over the million mark on average, because most houses in Sydney are over a million, and Melbourne. And we've got the average owner-occupied dwelling, and that's the average value there, is about 500,000. So why is it successful? Well, high productivity. If you put your people into more efficient industries, they make more money, and that's going to be spread around the economy as well. Got a good legal system. Not every country in the world has a strong legal system. You go into Indonesia and they make up the rules as they go along, and it depends on who pays the money. You know, some countries are corrupt. They've always been that way, and if they can't get out of that cycle of corruption, you don't get people investing. Large export sector. We have very high exports percentage economy. Got strong mining, agriculture exports, and a high distribution of wealth to low and middle income earners. Australia is a very egalitarian society. We have the highest minimum wage in the world, even higher than many European countries. So we do distribute wealth to low income earners, and so we don't get the huge disparities of wealth that you get in America. America's got much big. The poor are very poor, the wealth are very wealthy, and you get this huge disparity. But in Australia, it's a very equal society. And even the low income earners get a fairly good dispersion of income as well. Exports are doing well. Since 2016, the value of exports have more than doubled. This is what's actually pushing the budget into surplus. The government gets an excise on iron ore exports and coal. Both of them are just going gangbusters. So that's what's helping the budget go into surplus. And then there's a new export called LNG, liquid natural gas, liquefied natural gas. We've got about 6 or 7 new plants that we've built in the last 5 years, all starting to come in production, and they're peaking out next year. Their production is going through the roof. So that's a new export sector we didn't really have. We're now the biggest exporter of LNG in the world. Qatar used to be, but now we are. Now, those plants weren't, you don't build a, $5 billion or $10 billion plant if you think you're going to lose money. You build it in a country where you think there's strong laws, good prospects for exports, low, good wages, industrialisation systems. You don't have that happen unless you've got a good economy. So, if we've got a good economy, it comes back into your investments, and this can maintain your incomes over your retirement. Because one of the things you've got to remember is that we're going to try and pay you more income as you get older because your costs go up. If we don't have an economy producing more wealth and more income, we can't pay that. So the returns on your investments over the last, say, 10 years or 20 years, this is 20 years, the average growth fund has averaged more than CPI plus 3.5%. So that bar there has been achieved at least half the time. So you're getting, most on average, you're getting 3.5% above inflation on your returns. There is negatives. It drops in value, but doesn't mean you lose your money. It means the value drops of your investments. But that's what I said before, is when you can buy back in and buy cheap assets. If we don't buy cheap assets, you won't get a good income, because your income is a lot higher when you buy with cheap assets. So 2001 it dropped, 2008-9 that was a GFC, which was the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. We're unlikely to see that again. And that's one of the problems. One of the problems people are worrying about is they're saying, oh, if it's a recession, it must be a GFC type event. It's not, because the GFC was equivalent to a Great Depression. You had banks going broke around the world. You had governments then nearly going broke. It doesn't happen every decade. It happens once every 100 years, roughly. And all the reasons why the American banks went broke have now been fixed. So you're not going to have a problem from that source. But if you have a recession, like in 2001 and 2002, most people can't remember that. That was the tech boom, when we come off a tech boom. Now, that was a roughly a 2% drop in growth fund values at that time. You're still getting income, on your investment. Still getting rent, still getting dividends, and you're still getting dividends from bonds. But the value dropped. So you've got to remember, you're always getting an income. Even through the GFC, you've still got income. The incomes are averaging 5 to 6%. So you've got to factor in the value is not important, it's the income that you're getting. That pays for your retirement. So I'll leave it there, so hopefully you feel more confident. Yes, Brian, yes?
Russell, a couple of days ago, earlier this week, Russell, a couple of days ago, the Federal Treasurer made an address, and he was promoting the corporate sector to reinvest their profits rather than to issue those profits to shareholders in the form of dividends. Now, there was an add-on to that particular report. There was a self-funded retiree saying that here is a situation where effectively that policy of reinvesting profits will be at the expense of shareholders and those people who rely on dividends as part of their income, in particular self-funded retirees. Would you have a comment on that, please?
That's right, yeah. A couple of issues. If we look at most overseas share markets, their dividends are only around 2 to 3%. The issue there is they don't have a dividend imputation system like we have in Australia. So there's an incentive for companies in Australia to pay you a dividend because they've already paid tax on it. So there's a bias in Australia towards income. The second reason why there's a bias towards income is because we're a mature economy. We don't have new markets to expand into. Businesses will expand if there's new markets, there's new possibilities. But we're a mature economy. We're not going to double our GDP in the next 2 to 3 years by having an explosion of new wealth or new industries to go into. So there is a point when you get to a mature economy, the mature industries in it don't have much more to spend because they're responsible for the shareholders' money. They're saying, okay, if you've made a big profit this year, what do? Do we invest in a new business where we're going to make lots of money, or do we give it back to shareholders? The issue for a lot of businesses, they don't have those opportunities to make more money. Now, there's been a lot of companies in Australia who have gone overseas to look at new growth areas, and a lot of them haven't done that well. Wesfarmers just recently went over to Britain and bought a Bunnings chain, or equivalent of Bunnings chain over there, a hardware chain, and they completely mucked it up. They destroyed lots of capital. They've actually now sold it, and Wesfarmers have retreated from the UK market. So it's not easy to go overseas and make money, and you've got the shareholders' money at risk. So you always got to weigh up the risks of making money versus the risk of losing it as well. As I said, a mature economy will always generally have higher incomes because the investments they did 20, 30 years ago now come to fruition, that income's coming in. What you've got to bear in mind is that if you have less income now, you've got to, the risk is obviously investing it and then getting it back again in future dividends. I don't think that'll change the businesses in Australia too much because, as I said, where's the opportunities to invest? The second thing in America, though, is, and Europe, they don't pay high dividends is because they don't get the franking credits benefit, and secondly, people in America don't look to the income as their main source of benefit from their shares. They look for more capital growth, and they're willing to put their money into future investments. That is, instead of giving me a profit today, I want a profit in the future. Ultimately, that in the longer term, paying less dividends are good for the shareholders, but they've got to wait for it. But as I said, there's a risk in that. So I don't think that many companies will change their attitudes. They're making these decisions every day of where to put the capital. A speech by the Treasurer is not going to change their minds. They've got responsibility to shareholders, not to the government. So, yeah, that's answer there. Anyone else? Yeah. So I think yeah, well, if you've got that, hopefully it makes you feel a bit more comfortable about what's happening out there. The key issue is don't believe everything you read in newspapers. And if you do, just have a Bex and lie down. Oh yes, that's right. We'll send out the webinar on the website. So what we'll do is put it on our website, but we'll send you an email link to it if you want to look at any particular thing. So I'll have the text on plus the video. Okay, thanks for that.